Hello, and welcome to Keeping Up Appearances, a discussion on employee appearance codes and discrimination laws in Alaska. My name is Alex Reuter, and I'm the Special Projects Attorney with the Alaska State Commission for Human Rights. Now, what is the Alaska State Commission for Human Rights? The Alaska State Commission for Human Rights is the chief civil rights agency of the state. We are given the mission to eliminate and prevent discrimination for all Alaskans. We are led by 7 commissioners, appointed by the governor, confirmed by the legislature. Currently, they are Zachary Gottschall, Mae Marsh, William Craig, Jesse Ruffridge, Becky Carrillo, Sheila Cernich, and Doreen Lorenz. We enforce AS 1880, which is the Alaska Human Rights Act. Basically, this requires us to investigate claims of discrimination we receive, and then, if it looks like discrimination has occurred, we either conciliate or present the case at trial. And we advise the public on the state of discrimination law and conduct trainings and workshops, just like this one. So today, we're going to begin by talking about how AS 1880 applies to employee appearance policies, and then we're going to go through and talk about how employee appearance policies work in regards to sex discrimination, racial discrimination, religious discrimination, and then sort of just an overview of how all of that works, and then the one weird area with this being actors and models and the exemptions that are there under the First Amendment. AS 1880 and employee appearance policies. So while AS 1880 forbids discrimination in Alaska on a number of grounds, including race, sex, religion, personal appearance is not explicitly one of these. However, AS 1880 does forbid discrimination on the basis of race, religion, color, national origin, and sex in employment. And all of these characteristics can affect an employee's personal appearance. And as such, restrictions on these that fall disproportionately on one of these potential characteristics can be unlawful discrimination under AS 18. So, while reading the law may not explicitly say you can be discriminated against on the basis of your personal appearance, race, sex, religion, color, national origin. All of these things can affect your personal appearance, and as such, appearance policies can potentially be unlawfully discriminatory under AS 1880. So we're going to begin with sex discrimination. First, let's get this out of the way. An appearance policy that differentiates between the genders is, by itself, not necessarily discriminatory. You can have an appearance policy that addresses both men and women in different ways. However, the issue comes up whenever they are being treated unequally. The first step that we look at in determining if an appearance policy is unlawfully discriminatory based on sex is to look to see if a policy poses a significantly unequal burden. So slight differences, again, can be lawful, but when there is a significantly unequal burden between the genders, that's when we have unlawful discrimination. So, for example, in this case called Fountain v. Safeway, there was a policy that just said, hey, men have to wear neckties. That is itself not significantly unequal. Is there a slight burden on men to have to wear neckties? Yes, but it wasn't significant enough to be unlawful. Alternatively, a policy that female, but not male, flight attendants must be under a certain weight definitely poses a significant unequal burden. This was established in the case Girdham v. Continental Airlines. Having an appearance policy for one gender, but not others, is almost always going to, set off alarms. It's going to be suspect. In addition to unequal burdens carried out by one sex, sex stereotyping can also be considered sex discrimination. This comes from a very important Supreme Court case called Price Waterhouse v. Hopkins, where a woman was denied a promotion for failing to present as sufficiently feminine. Appearance policies that force a gender of employees to inappropriately lean into sex stereotypes can also be found to be sex discrimination. And this can include, again, weight policies that require women to be thinner. This was found to be unlawful as a sex stereotype, and Frank v. United Airlines, unlike the previous example, which was found to pose a significantly unequal burden. Dress codes that require revealing clothing, like EEOC v. Sage Realty, can lean into sex stereotypes, and burdensome makeup requirements, as discussed in Jesperson v. Harris. Customers' preference for a stereotype is never a defense. So just to be clear, if you are, run a bar and you notice that there is a customer preference for scantily dressed female bartenders, that is not a defense against a discrimination complaint. The fact that it is a preference from the consumer never justifies a complaint of discrimination. So a big case I want to talk about is the 2020 ruling in Bostock v. Clayton County. With that, sex stereotyping as sex discrimination has taken on a greater meaning. Bostock v. Clayton County involved complaints of discrimination, of sex-based discrimination from a number of transgender and homosexual employees, basically arguing that if they had been in similar positions but had been a different sex assigned at birth, then they would have been treated differently, and as such, that constitutes sex discrimination. The Supreme Court agreed with them, and so we now have some additional rulings that apply to transgender employees and employees with same-sex attraction. So, for an example, a non-discriminatory sex-segregated dress code would become discriminatory if it is enforced to only comply to a sex assigned at birth. So say, you had a completely okay dress code that had rules for both men and women, and then you have a transgender employee who, perhaps while assigned male at birth, now presents as a transgender woman, requiring this transgender woman to, say, wear a traditionally male clothing and comply with the male appearance policy would be considered discrimination and unlawful sex stereotyping. However, this does not mean that the dress code is waived. It is non-discriminatory to, say, reprimand a transgender woman for wearing a skirt shorter than would be permitted by the appearance policy. So this isn't a get-out-of-jail-free card. However, you do need to be cognizant that you cannot discriminate in your appearance policies against transgender employees or employees with same-sex attractions. Similarly, reprimanding a gay male employee for being girly with a customer, we would also see as discriminatorily sex stereotyping. Appearance policies and racial discrimination. Unlike sex, employee appearance policies cannot be differentiated dependent on race. You are not allowed to have an appearance policy that treats people of different races differently. Additionally, facially neutral appearance policies applied regardless of race can still be racially discriminatory if it disparately impacts a certain race without being justified by legitimate employment goals. So aesthetic preferences alone are not typically treated as sufficiently legitimate goals. So, for example, a policy that explicitly banning kuspuks, for an example, or another type of ethnic dress, but allowing casual clothing, would likely be racially discriminatory despite not addressing race. You see how race isn't mentioned there? However, it explicitly bans some form of clothing or hairstyle or something like that that is almost always associated with a particular race or ethnicity. That is still going to be racial discrimination. Grooming policies in the Crown Act. This has been a big push at the national level lately. And that's the potentially discriminatory effect of hair policies. The Crown Act, you see it a lot. Crown stands for Creating a Respectful and Open World for Natural Hair, is a piece of legislation explicitly enshrining discrimination based on traditional hairstyles as illegal, and has been adopted in many jurisdictions starting around 2020. At the federal level, it is awaiting Senate judiciary consideration to be added to the 1964 Civil Rights Act. It is not yet included in the federal civil rights sphere. Alaska has adopted a Crown Act. However, it is limited to only banning school grooming policies that prohibit hairstyles traditionally associated with race. Despite there currently being no federal or state legislation that explicitly prohibits hairstyle discrimination, if a policy meets the previously discussed disparate impact test, that being that it has a disparate impact on, say, a particular race or ethnicity, it can still be found to be illegally racially discriminatory. So, for example, if a grooming policy only bans locks, twists, tight coils, afros, cornrows, and bantu knots, that appears to be having a disparate impact on a specific race without a legitimate interest, and as such, could be racially discriminatory. Additionally, several jurisdictions have found that due to the overrepresentation of pseudofolliculitis barbae among black men, which is sort of a skin disease that comes from whenever they have to shave their face, grooming policies that require clean-shaven employees without a legitimate justification can be illegally discriminatory. This came up in Bradley v. Pizza Co., which was, I think, a Domino's chain that required all of their delivery drivers to be clean-shaven. If you don't have a reason to do that, like having, like, say, some more protective gear fit onto a face, that's often going to be seen as likely discriminatory. Now let's talk about appearance policies and religious discrimination. So while these policies can discriminate against employees based on their religion, just like they could on their basis of their race or their gender, the test to determine illegal religious discrimination is distinct. This is due in large part to the unique protections religious practices have in the USA, just classic First Amendment stuff. So for religious discrimination to occur, first an employee must hold a bona fide religious belief that is being threatened by an employer policy, and the employee must make this conflict known to their employer. So if you have a policy that the employer does not know about, you can't do unlawful religious discrimination. You really should make sure that you inform a supervisor that, hey, this appearance policy will actually affect my religious expression, and as such, I can't do that. Second, an employer must show either that they have made a good faith effort to accommodate this religious belief, or show that it could not be reasonably accommodated without undue hardship. This definition of undue hardship in this context was recently ruled as a burden, here's the quote, substantial in the overall context of an employer's business. And that just changed with the Supreme Court's ruling in Groff v. DeJoy. So, if an appearance policy's sole purpose is aesthetic, it will almost always need to accommodate a bona fide religious belief. If you just have something because, hey, this is sort of the appearance that we like to put forward, you will always, always, always need to accommodate a religious request. So for example, a no hat policy has to allow for yarmulkes or headscarves. A no visible tattoo policy should allow for employees to display, say, traditional kakunin or a yidiltu. A no facial hair policy should allow for Sikh or Muslim employees to have beards. And a no long hair policy should allow for Native men to keep their hair long if it's in keeping with their cultural practices. The biggest reason to not grant religious accommodations to an appearance policy is workplace safety. This is when an employer will have the best argument to stand on. So for an example, a niqab with its sort of long flowing, robes cannot be safely worn in a factory with conveyor belts, right? That flowing clothing could get caught in and cause someone physical harm. You can work with someone to find a different accommodation. So keep in mind, though, that even when it is an issue of workplace safety, we still are going to look for a good faith effort at accommodation. Maybe in that instance, you can tuck a niqab into some form of, hazmat suit, something of that nature. All right, so let's review what we've talked about with appearance policies. Number one, appearance policies can be sex segregated. However, they cannot impose an unequal burden on sex stereotypes. Appearance policies cannot force transgender employees to dress in a manner different than their gender identity. Appearance policies that forbid only clothing or hairstyles that are traditionally associated with a race are often illegally discriminatory. And reasonable accommodations should typically be given to bona fide religious practices that are forbidden by appearance policies, with the biggest exception again being when an accommodation would be unsafe. So just a brief review. What are some do's and don'ts for employers who are worried about the language in their appearance policy? Here is a don't. Female employees must wear skirts, have hair professionally done, have nails painted, and may not wear flats. Why does this seem like a don't? This is an unequal sex burden. This only applies to female employees. There is no regulation on, say, male employees. This is almost always going to be found to be significantly unequal. Here's an example of a better policy. Employees should come to work dressed in business formal, with male employees in ties and all employees in closed-toed shoes. This applies to everyone. There are some extra applications to male employees to have ties. However, that is not a significant burden. Don't. Female employees must wear skirts that reveal thigh, and male employees may not have earrings in. This is a bad policy. Why is it? Because of sex stereotyping. This policy encourages sexualization of women and discourages practices that could be seen as traditionally more feminine in men. So a better policy would be all employees should look clean and professional when coming in for work. Here's another don't. Employees may not wear locks, twists, tight coils, afros, or cornrows. This is a policy that seems to be limiting hairstyles traditionally associated with a particular race or ethnicity. Here is a much better policy. Employees must have their hair kept clean and not dyed a color unnatural to humans. That is a policy that you could have in place to ensure that there is some form of, professional decorum among your employees. Here's one last bad policy. All applicants with visible tattoos will not be considered for hiring purposes. Do not say this. Remember, people could have tattoos for religious or cultural reasons, and as such, automatically denying consideration would mean that you are committing religious discrimination. A better policy would say applicants should not have visible tattoos unless displayed for a religious or cultural purpose. Now you have an exemption in there. Now I know you're not committing religious discrimination. So what is the big elephant in the room here? That would be actors and models. When appearance policy is enforced to ensure that a certain message is communicated, policies that could be illegally discriminatory may be protected under the First Amendment. So, for example, I would say that, hey, you can't have this appearance policy that improperly is sex stereotyping. However, say you're looking for an actress to play a particular role. Now, by me enforcing that policy, I am affecting your freedom of speech. That is going to be problematic for me. So, the courts have only occasionally commented on this matter, typically limiting enforcement to casting decisions for advertisements, stage plays, television shows, movies, things of that nature. The crucial element is that an employee's appearance in the context is sufficiently imbued with elements of communication. This came up in the case of Dallas v. Stanklin. So in a case alleging that The Bachelor and The Bachelorette only hired white actors and actresses for the titular roles, the court ruled that forcing racially blind hiring would regulate the content of the shows, which the First Amendment forbids. And so in this instance, there could be no asserted claim of potential discrimination. In a similar case, where a black chorus member was fired from a Broadway production to avoid, in the director's words, a white savior story, the courts ruled that enforcing discrimination laws would constitute a regulation of constitutionally protected expressive discretion not to stage an all-black chorus that tells a story contrary to one it wishes to tell. This was in Moore v. Hadestown, Broadway. So in this case, there was, a black employee, and then because of an appearance policy, they said, I don't want to have a black employee be visible here. I want a white employee to be visible there instead. That is on its face racial discrimination. However, I cannot enforce anti-discrimination laws in this instance because that is too closely related to First Amendment protected free speech. One more example, in a case where a New Jersey casino required its here's the name it says, Borgata babes to wear a skimpy uniform that's stereotyped based on sex. The courts ruled that enforcing civil rights laws would be unconstitutional as an element of performance, and a public appearance component was part of the Borgata babe position. This is from Shivo v. Marina District Development. Long story short, this area of court doctrine is really underdeveloped, but here is a rule of thumb, is that if an employee's appearance is crucial to communicating a business's ideas, the relevant appearance policy could be exempt from AS 1880 and other civil rights laws. The test is always going to be how related that appearance is to some form of First Amendment protected free expression. So if you're interested in reading about other things on this matter, I would suggest you to look at the U.S. Crown Act and its consideration in Congress, the EEOC dress code guidance. The State Human Resources Management pushes out a dress code guidance document, and Asher also has guidance documents on religious discrimination and discrimination against the LGBTQIA+ community. Those can both be found at our website at humanrights.alaska.gov. A brief disclaimer, this presentation includes images and references to the creative property of others. This property is being used under claim of fair use, which is under 17 U.S.C. 107. This presentation was created pursuant to the fair use guidelines, and further use or distribution is not permitted. And nothing in this presentation is intended to offend or ridicule any suspect classes under 42 U.S.C. 1983 et seq. Thank you so much for coming, and if you have any other questions, feel free to reach out. Again, this is with the Alaska State Commission for Human Rights. We have a number of resources on our website at humanrights.alaska.gov, and you can file a complaint for investigation at 907-274-4692. Thank you so much for coming to this presentation, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.